This conference will now be recorded.
So yes, that's Malachi chapter 2. It's fairly gloomy. God's obviously very angry. I mean, some of that language, when you think about it, is pretty graphic. Like, behold, I will rebuke your offspring in verse 3, and I will spread dung on your faces. So that's the sort of thing that you do to a puppy dog when it, makes a mess in the house. You grab the dog and you sort of rub it in and you say, don't do that again. And God says, I'm going to spread dung on your faces and I'm going to carry you away with the dung of your offerings. So when you think about it, that's pretty graphic. God is actually obviously very angry with their behavior. And there's a lot of judgment from God here against the priesthood in the first few verses, against the Levites, and then against the common people for their behavior. So I think when you kind of think about God, this is quite hard to deal with. God being that angry about this and that judgmental. You sort of think of God of love and a God of compassion and a God of mercy, and it's like, whoa, this is heavy going when you really think about it. Well, I thought it was quite heavy going. So I thought quickly I would recap a little bit on what Josh was talking about in terms of the timing. So years ago, I did quite a bit of work on the post-captivity and placing the prophets and the timing and the order of where things happened. And for a while, I was pretty convinced where Malachi sat, and then I went off and read a whole lot of other stuff and found some other tantalizing ideas of exactly where Malachi sat, and I semi-adopted them until I went back to my original, I suppose, traditional view as to where Malachi sits, because I think chapter 2 is the key. Chapter 2 and chapter 3 are really the key to the timing. So let's just go back and look at a little bit of history for everybody. So we'll run through and see if we can spot exactly where Malachi chapter 2 is in history. So the children of Israel went into captivity for 70 years, and then they came out under the decree of Cyrus to go and restore and build Jerusalem. And the first job was to go and get the temple back in order. So the story of Haggai and Zechariah is all about going and rebuilding the temple. And it's a call to go and rebuild the temple, but they had lots of challenges that they faced when they got there, because they had a lot of foreigners were now in and around that area. Because they didn't have their own country and state law, all of a sudden you had all of these foreigners, particularly in Haggai and Zechariah's time, it was the Samaritans. And the Samaritans caused all sorts of trouble around the building of the temple. Not only that, the people were real concerned about building their own house, because they'd just been away to captivity, they've got home, they wanted to build their own house, and they're like, I've got enough work to do just to build my own house, rather than having to build the temple. So it was a bit of a struggle, but eventually they got things done, and under the instruction of Haggai and Zechariah and the prophets, they managed to complete the construction of the temple. But the city as a whole was still very much left in rack and ruin after Nebuchadnezzar's invasion. So the walls were broken down, houses were destroyed, the city wasn't really operable. And so what happened was they had difficulty instituting the full temple practice. So reinstituting all the temple services and all the feasts and all the offerings wasn't easy, because it was a dangerous place. There were so many foreigners around, the city was in rack and ruin, and they didn't have security of the walls. And so eventually what happened, along came these messengers all the way down to see this guy down here, who was the king's cupbearer, Nehemiah. That's not actually, that's Esther, and but I just pitched this one because it's kind of the king sitting next to him. Oh, it is actually a bit. So yeah, supposedly that's Nehemiah, the king's cupbearer, bowing down and pleading with the king and saying, I need to go back and sort out what's going on in Israel. So Nehemiah comes down to Israel. He surveys it and he sees it's in rack and ruin. although the temple's there, the people are very disheartened. And it's not just the Samaritans now. He faced three characters, which were these three notorious guys. Who knows what their names were? Yep. And the worst of them all, who becomes the worst of them all? Tobiah, yeah. So Sanballat, Geshem, and Tobiah, these three guys. So kind of one's an Arabianite, one's an Arabian and Horonite, and I think what the other one was. But they caused all sorts of problems. They did everything possible to try to stop construction or building of the wall. So they got in the way of all the construction. In fact, they planned an assassination attempt on Nehemiah. But of course, Nehemiah was so determined, he got all the people, and remarkably, so much so that all the enemies sat back and went, wow, how did that happen? 52 days later, the wall was complete. 52 days, they just went through and they resecured the wall. Now what they had was they had a city which had secure walls and they had a temple. So they thought they'd have a big celebration, and Nehemiah went and called for a celebrity guest. So he went and found this priest, Ezra, and he said, I want you to come to the dedication of the walls and to present to the people. Now, at the time, going by chronology, Ezra is over 100 years old. So he's a pretty old man. So he gets out there and he stands up in the middle of the street and he speaks all day, at least from morning till noon. So he speaks for a long time. But he really got into the hearts of the people. So then they had celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles, which was one of the most amazing feasts. And the conscience pricked to the people. They really thought, right, we need to change. So what they do is they come and they make some agreements. Now, everybody now can turn to the key points as to what connects us to Malachi chapter 2 and have a look at Nehemiah chapter 10. And maybe you can keep your finger in Malachi chapter 2 and think about what you read in Malachi chapter 2. And then let's read what the people say in this section of Nehemiah. So I'm not going to read the first part because that's got a fair amount of names. But we want to read from really verse 28 to the end. So where did we get up to? 2 verses each. You finished? Yep. So Nehemiah chapter 10 from verse 28, and then we'll go back around to that. Yep.
And the rest of the people, priests, Levites, gatekeepers, singers, temple servants, and all who separated themselves from the neighboring peoples for the sake of the law of God, together with their wives and all their sons and daughters who are able to understand it. All these now join their brothers and nobles and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God given through Moses, the servant of God, and to obey carefully all the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord our God.
We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us or take their daughters for ourselves. When the neighbouring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holiday. Every 7th year we will forgo working the land and will cancel all debts.
We assume the responsibility to carry out the 30th schedule each year for the service of the house of God. The bread set out on the table, and the regular grain offerings and burnt offerings, the offerings on the Sabbaths, new moon festivals, and feasts, the holy offerings, the sin offerings to make atonement for Israel, and for all the duties of the house of our God.
And we cast the lots among the priests the Levites and the people for the wood offering, bring it into the house of our God. Of our Father that times appointed year to year to burn upon the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law, and to bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all fruit, all trees year by year unto the house of the Lord.
As it is also written in the law, we will bring the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, of our herds and of our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests ministering there. Moreover, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of our God, to the priests, the first part of our meal of our grain offerings, of the fruit of all of our trees, and of our new wine and oil. And we will bring the tithe of our crops to the Levites, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all the towns where we work.
The priest descended from Aaron is to accompany the Levites when they receive the tithes, and the Levites are to bring a tenth of the tithes up to the house of our God, to the storerooms of the treasury. The people of Israel, including the Levites, are to bring their contributions of grain, new wine, and oil to the storerooms where the articles for the sanctuary, and where the ministering priests, the gatekeepers, and the singers play, who will not neglect the house of our God.
Cool. So you'll notice in this chapter, this after the building of the walls and after they resettled in the land, they could now focus on organizing the temple service. They hadn't been able to do this for years. They tried and it failed. And the reason it failed is because they didn't have any structure in the city. They didn't have any protection around them. And there was a lot of influence of other nations that were there in the area. So now they've got that, they all get together, and it's quite specific. It's the priests, the Levites, and the rulers of Judah. So there's three classes of people, and they all sign off on this agreement. And what you find is that they enter into a covenant, and all the list of the names are signed. This is like a treaty. You know, you can imagine this is a formal declaration. It is a vow that they're making. They are entering into a vow, and it quite specifically says, and we put ourselves under the curse of the law. They did that voluntarily. They assessed because they knew the consequences of it. In verse 29, they joined their brothers and nobles, and they entered into a curse and an oath. So they had heard the law of Moses, but they knew they had weighed up the pros and cons and saw the benefits outweighed the risk. And they said, let's enter into this. And they got all the people to sign it, priests, Levites, people of Judah, and they signed a vow to God. When you think about that, that's now puts a little bit of perspective on Malachi chapter 2. Because what happened is when you come to Nehemiah chapter 13, a few chapters later, and we'll look at this a little bit more, it says, it lists everything that suddenly happens in Jerusalem. And then Nehemiah says, while all this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem. Because in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some years, I asked for leave of the king, which we find out was 12 years. So Nehemiah had to go back. He had state duties. He was the king's cupbearer. He had managed to get long service leave when he built the temple. And now he had to go back and had to acquire more long service leave, and he had to work for 12 years. So he had to work for 12 years to acquire long service leave and then to come back to Jerusalem. What do you think he found when he came back to Jerusalem? Well, it's in chapter 13. He found exactly what we're reading in Malachi chapter 2. When Nehemiah went away, you find he comes back and every single one of those things that the people entered into a vow, they had broken. Not just broken, they had totally destroyed it. He found that they had stopped giving their offerings, they'd stopped laying up tithes, they had stopped providing for the Levites. They were marrying all the strange foreign people that worshipped foreign gods, so much so that their children were speaking foreign language. And he says, what are you doing? So he came back and he's like, what's happened? And he went mad. He went mad. He just went into a total frenzy. Now that's Malachi chapter 3. The Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to the temple. The messenger of the covenant. What covenant? The covenant they had entered into. So they had entered into a covenant, and the messenger of that covenant that they signed it was Nehemiah, and he came back in Malachi chapter 3, and he's going to purify the sons of Levi. So I'm not going to steal thunder of Malachi chapter 3, that's somebody else's job. But now when you come back to Malachi chapter 2 and think about this chapter, I think, does that put that in context as to within 12 years, Malachi chapter 2 is dealing with that moment at the end of the 12 years, what it was like. And God was, preempting. Malachi was, behold, I send my messenger before my face. Malachi's name means the messenger. So Malachi comes with this message. Malachi chapter 2 says, this is the state you're in. God's going to judge. The messenger of the covenant is coming. I'm the messenger to prepare the way before him. Who's the him? Nehemiah. So that's the first instance of the first application of Malachi. Obviously, it applies to John the Baptist and Jesus did the same thing when he went into the temple. And like Nehemiah, he went into a fit of rage because they had made the temple a den of thieves. Interesting. I said to Catherine, though, it was one of the things that might explain why Nehemiah had this thing about pulling people's hair out. Because when you entered into a vow as a Nazirite, you consecrated your hair as your offering as a Nazirite, and you dedicated that, and it was shaved and it was offered on the altar to God. They had all entered into a voluntary vow, just like a Nazirite. When he comes back, it's like, chop. Anyway, that's just a side, but maybe not. But maybe it explains his anger and his frustration. Okay, let's go back to Malachi chapter 2. So in the light of that, what positive things can you find out in Malachi chapter 2? There's heaps of negative stuff. You can see God angry. You can understand why God's going to judge. But can we spin the cube and can we see this positively? What's behind this? Positive things. I'll write it on my board.
Well, with God, with my covenant was life and peace.
Yep. So God had a covenant with Levi. Covenant with Levi. That's life and peace. Life and peace. What does he say about that covenant?
The verse is, I gave them to him with fear, when he feared me and was afraid for my name.
What does he say about the covenant with Levi?
The Lord he revered
Sorry?
He revered God.
He revered God. Yeah. So lots of positive things about the covenant made with Levi, and because of that, what does God say?
So I have caused you to be despised and humiliated because you have not followed my ways. Verse 9. That's negative, but the positive is that God's trying to save them. He's warning them.
Exactly. And the key to it is that if we look verse 4 carefully, so you shall know that I have sent this commandment to you that my covenant with Levi may stand. See, that's the point, isn't it? God's not disannulling the covenant. The whole point of this is that he's dealing with this so that he's like, you've broken your covenant with me in every way, shape, or form. Priests and Levites of this generation. But my covenant with Levi predates you. It goes way back before you, and it's a relationship that goes right back to the beginning. And I'm not going to break my covenant. You might have broken yours. I'm not going to break mine. Therefore, if I have to rub your nose and manure, this is what it's going to take to turn you back to be faithful priests and Levites, and that's what I'll do. So you see the positive spin on it is God is judging, but this is, in an absolute truest sense, this is discipline, isn't it? This is, a father loves his children, will discipline them. And they desperately needed it, and so he disciplined them to try to educate. So I think you can really see that positive side of God out with the Levites. So it's about discipline and restoration. And it's God's honour to his promise. True? To his, please be introduced. But, okay. Like that?
There's some more pins in the little room.
Ah, that's all right. It's fine.
In the corner, the right hand corner, Catherine, on the shelf. Yeah. Top shelf.
So I think what's interesting in light of that, what God is saying in terms of his relationship with the priests and Levites, you'll notice he then turns that around in terms of the way Judah has profaned their covenant. So if you've got a Bible with a different section, you'll find from verse 10, there's quite a different section. Then I've got what their section changed for verse 10. What does it say for yours? From verse 10. Yeah, just what the section change is. It got to be Judah unfaithful, yeah. So you'll see that he's dealing, the first part of it is with the priests and Levites. The judgment starts with the priests and Levites, and this is about their covenant with God. And then he starts talking about Judah's unfaithfulness, and in that, he talks about this unfaithfulness with their marriage relationships. And he brings them back to the same point as he is with Levi. My covenant with Levi would always stand. I will never break my covenant. And then he says, so you've been unfaithful to the wife of your youth. You've been unfaithful. And he says, you need to restore the faithfulness of your covenant from the beginning. And he goes right back to creation, if you like, or to the formation of Adam and Eve, when he says, God hath made them one and hath given them one spirit, and he hath made them man and wife. So therefore, guard yourselves in your spirit and do not be faithless. Okay, anything else that people can find in there?
Yeah, it seems to me he's saying there, there was one father, there was one covenant, and therefore one fellowship. And I think, as you just pointed out, you relate that to through the marriage as well. That's the principle that God wants. And, you have one, there's a oneness about it, a unity about it. And of course, in the context of the Levites, my mind went back to who was on the Lord's side when the golden calf. Of course, it was the Levites, wasn't it? They were the ones who came to the Exodus 32, who came, if you like, to the Lord's side when they made the golden calf. So, so there seems to me to be a link with them, what Levites were about.
Yeah, I wonder whether or not there's a little bit of a connection back to Ezra as well. You know, like Ezra was this incredible, faithful, you know, priest that they all sort of looked up to. And you know, made a point that he stood before them all day. And it was Ezra's words and it was Ezra's reading of the word that made them all suddenly say, oh, we've got to change. So it kind of, you know, I think it goes all the way back to his original covenant with Levi, but it's almost he's reminding them, don't forget, you know, you entered into this covenant because you heard Ezra. You heard what he said, and that's what made you change. So he takes them back to that original agreement that they heard from Ezra. One little quick thing, which is probably stealing a little bit of Malachi chapter 3 for whoever's doing it, but it's one of my, again, favourite little connections just to show, to prove the context. So when you come back to Nehemiah chapter 13, which is when Nehemiah comes back after the 12-year hiatus back, and he gets really angry. You'll notice that, you know, the prime evil character was this guy Tobiah, who had been given prime location within the temple area, and particularly in where the storehouses were kept for storing up grain for the Levites. And I believe that was Tobiah being very strategic. You know, he managed to find a place that's where he took up residence, in the place where they needed to actually provide for the Levites. And that's why he got really angry. So on his rant and his rave, when he goes through and he kicks out Tobiah, he cleans out, he purifies the Levites, he kicks out those that are buying and selling on the Sabbath day, all the way through, he's got these beautiful little pauses where he's praying to God. I think it's just beautiful, isn't it? Like, we can see them in that chapter, where he's like on this massive frenzy of action, and he just stops. And he's got prayer to God.
Remember me for this, O my God.
Yep, there's that
Do
one.
not blot out what I have so faithfully done in the house of my God and its services.
Yeah, isn't it? I love that. Remember, it's Nehemiah was the one that was called before the king. He was the king's cupbearer. He was called before the king, and he told him all the problems. The king said to Nehemiah, "What do you want?" He says, "So I pray to the Lord." So Nehemiah is the one that stops right before the king and prays before he even talks to the king. Yeah, I just find that quite amazing about this man. But in the middle of his judgments, he's doing the same thing. He's on this frenzy, you know, action, but he stops and he prays and he says, "Remember me, O my Lord." And I think that's because no one likes to do judgment. It's not something he wanted to do, but in his heart, the reason he was doing it was always to turn people back. This was like Jesus overthrowing money changers. So that's one. Where was that verse again, Jackie?
13 verse 14.
13 verse 14.
And
Yep.
then there's the one right at the very end, remember me with favor. And verse 22 as well.
Yep. So yeah, so 3 times. And then see verse 22, he says, "Remember also in favour and spare me according to your steadfast love." That's a very interesting phrase, isn't it? Spare me according to your steadfast love. So Nehemiah was very conscious that he needed salvation as well in all this action. Now come across to Malachi chapter 3, because Malachi chapter 3 is written right at the time of when these things happen. And it says, verse 16 and 17, if anyone wants to read that.
They therefore the Lord spake often one to another, and they all hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him, for them that feared the Lord and thought on his name. They shall be mine, says the Lord of hosts, from that day when I make up my jewels. I'll spare them as a man spares his own son that suits.
Isn't that beautiful? You know, in the middle of this frenzy, he's going, remember me, spare me. And then Malachi says, a book of remembrance was written for those that fear the Lord and think on his name, and he shall spare them as one spares his own son. So I find that just one of the most beautiful connections between Malachi chapter 3 and then 13, and I'm sorry whoever's doing Malachi next week because I stole your thunder. But it's kind of interesting in relation to Malachi chapter 2, isn't it? Okay. Any other comments or questions? Otherwise, I'm going to give you a 5-minute take on something, which is challenging. And it's on the subject of that last little section, which is quite a challenging section in and around the subject of divorce. In the authorized version, and in a couple of other versions, the net translation, probably most of the older translations, it says the Lord hates divorce, therefore it goes on to talk about these things. And I recently kind of heard that quoted, and that makes a lot of sense, except for there's a few problems with that when you think about it. It's because the law specifically had in it the letter of the bill of divorcement, and God gave it under the law. So if the law is holy, just, and good, why does God permit something that he hates? He hates it, it's an abomination. How come there's a permission? Deuteronomy chapter 24 is all about the story of the bill of divorcement. In essence, it's a permission slip from God that says under these circumstances, boom, 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 you are permitted to take this out. God gives that permission. So it's a challenge to turn around and say, you know, it's an absolute abomination, it's a sin, divorce, and God hates it, and then argue how God allows this in the law. So that's a little bit of a challenge. You'll find that Paris's translation, which she read that verse, which was really cool. ESV, was it? Or NIV? Okay, NIV. Do you want to read it again? Because yours was pretty good. 16.
The man that hates him divorces his wife, says the Lord, the God of Israel, was violence to the one who should be checked, says the Lord Almighty.
So now this is a little bit different. And the Septuagint, the ESV, the NIV, all the CSV, all have the same translation. And that is, I've got the ESV and it says the same one. So it says, the man who does not love his wife but divorces her, says the Lord, covers his garment with violence. Now, I think it's just a point about this translation, which I think is important. It takes the difference away in the sense that this is the man's action, what he does with divorce, as opposed to God's commentary on divorce. Now, there's no doubt about it, of course, that, you know, divorce is certainly not the ideal. But under the law, clearly, God gave this permission slip to show that in certain circumstances, it was, if you like, the lesser of two evils. So the evil would be if a man saw his wife unfaithful and she had committed adultery, and he was so angry that a root of jealousy gathered in there and he couldn't find it in his heart to forgive. That's why Jesus says that this law was given because of the hardness of your heart. So the problem is the man could not bring himself to forgive, and then he grows in his anger and his hatred and his jealousy and his bitterness like cancer. That affects the relationship, that affects the kids, that affects everybody else. God says in this situation, a bill of divorcement is a better, separation is a better situation. Because that can be the only explanation why you can have it in the law. In this situation, in Malachi chapter 3, think about this. Under the law, the bill of divorcement was very gender biased. It was only a man that could divorce a woman. What happened in Malachi's day was that men took advantage of this bill of divorcement, and they took advantage of their situation, and they used these things for their own infidelity. So Deuteronomy 24 is about the woman being unfaithful, but this is about the men being unfaithful. And the woman under the law had no right at all to divorce her husband. There was nothing there. And that left her very vulnerable, because it left her in a situation where she was entrapped, imprisoned in the relationship. If the husband wanted to do whatever he wanted to do, or if the husband put her in a huge, terrible situation, because everybody would look and say, oh, he's divorced his wife under the law, that's because of infidelity of the woman, we shouldn't touch her, she's been unfaithful. So she was in a lose-lose situation. If she stayed in the relationship and her husband was unfaithful, she was imprisoned by that relationship. If he divorced her, she was in society, left a complete outcast. And it's one of the most terrible things under the law when men took advantage of things that were happening around. And God here is appealing to the wife of their youth. This is God's desperate appeal for them to consider this gift that he had given them of this beautiful young bride. Because what he says, I brought you together. That's what this is all about when it's saying, the Lord brought you together. I gave you this gift, and think about the violence of your actions. In fact, you see where it says, so guard yourself and your spirit, where it says, he that divorces her, says the Lord, verse 16, covers his garment with violence. So the Hebrew idea of this idea of covered his garments with violence, the idea of overshadowing your garment was the idea of bringing into protection. It was a marriage relationship. Remember Ruth? She went up into the Boaz and she went under his garments. And the idea of we come under the garments of the Lord, we're under the wings of the Lord. The garment is the protection of the husband, and it was a symbol of protection. So when a man does this to his wife, he covers his garments with violence. This is violence on his wife. This is violence that he's doing to her. So I just thought that was a bit of a quick take, because the two really challenging things under the law, the bill of divorcement and the trial of the unfaithful woman with a bit of waters in Numbers chapter 5 are two of the most horrific chapters in the Old Testament. Both of them are actually a beautiful appeal to mercy. It was God's constant appeal for them to have love and compassion and not to divorce their wives. Not for my, that was a little side. I thought I had to throw that in, especially as we've been kind of considering some of these things lately. By the way, Joseph was able to put away his wife legally. He was able to, with Mary, under the law of Numbers chapter 5, he could have brought her to the judges of Israel and had her basically put under a curse of public humiliation. But he said he was a righteous man and he chose not to do that. I think that's what, that Numbers 5 was always appealing to people, not to do this. Think about it. Even if she is unfaithful, think about the consequences. Do you really want to do this to her? The answer is show mercy, show compassion. Yes. Yeah. And God, in terms of Israel. Like God's trying to bring Israel back. It was all that process. But yeah.
The thing is, it's also interesting to look at, if you look at it through from verse 10 through to the end there, intertwined in all this is the garment. And what he's saying in verse 11 is Judah has got officials with him and long lives committed, etc. Playboys and they've married the daughter of a strange god. I'm just trying to see where it's talked about the garment there. The Lord will cut off the man that doeth this to his master. But if we come down to verse 14, we see where am I? Oh, here. So we see there that for example, the word companion. I've got a note in my Bible there that the word is actually linked to the joining of the curtain in the tabernacle. So,
All right.
yeah. So so therefore, it seems to me that in terms of that garment, what God is saying is, don't rent it.
Yeah.
It's got to be in one piece, or don't fracture it. And it seems to me there's an underlying principle there of covenant relationship, of the covenant that we make in marriage. That the teaching seems to be, don't split the garment, don't rent it. Anyway, that's just my take. I see it there. Yeah, because I do believe in what in verse 16 and what it's saying here, to rend that garment is an affront to me.
Yes.
Absolute affront to me.
Yeah, and it just must have been horrible for those, like those Hebrew wives when, the men of Judah started having these, relationships with the women of the land. And we obviously know from Nehemiah chapter 13, it was right. And obviously, and maybe it's because after the Babylonian invasion, most of the whole area of Judah was left completely decimated. So when Jerusalem suddenly became secure and sound and walls, people came from everywhere. So all these foreign people suddenly came in there as well, because it was a place of protection. But that left opportunities for trading, but it also left all sorts of opportunities that were there in Jerusalem. So it's amazing in a short 12-year period how they had strayed. It's mind-boggling, really. It's almost like, Nehemiah went away for 12 years and obviously he didn't have live feed, news updates to how bad it was, but he was probably starting to hear that it was getting bad. But I don't think he could have imagined when he got back to Jerusalem where it had gone in 12 years' time. And obviously the people, they didn't see how bad it was either. It's, the story with the frog and the pot. It obviously got worse and worse, but they didn't see it because it's like, it says you've poured out your tears on the altar requesting things from me and you're not receiving them. And you ask, why not? And then at the end of it, they're saying, well, where's the God of justice? So they don't seem to understand their situation. They don't seem to understand why God's not listening to them or why things have gone bad, because they haven't really been able to see just how bad they were. Probably not till Nehemiah comes and exposes it that they suddenly really go, oh yeah, oh, maybe we should have been doing that. Pretty good life lesson, I suppose.
It's interesting at the end here where it says, verse 17, he wearied the Lord with the words. You can say, we're really wearied them. And where's the God of judgment? It's a bit like 2 Peter 3 for the end time, saying, knowing this verse that there shall come the last days, scoffers walking after their own lusts and saying, where is the promise of his coming? This is the Bible tells us that all things continue as they were. So it's that same sort of contempt of judgment, isn't it? Where they're querying, where is he? So you get the answer in the next chapter.
Yes, and then the drama of chapter 3, which comes next. Some good drama in chapter 3.
Verse 16 also talking about something other than divorce, of a man divorcing his wife. Because the Lord is talking. And I'm kind of reading it as God saying, I'm your wife and you are hating me. And you're doing violence to me and you should protect me.
But I think behind that, there's the same analogy, which is why I think he talked about the priests and Levites with their covenant to him. So it was like, now what's the one in Corinthians? No, you're not, that he is joined to a harlot or something. You cannot like join yourself to God and join yourself to a harlot. And that's what they were doing. They were trying to play both sides. So I think the type is there, but I think if you go to the context, I think it's very real. And if you go to the context of Nehemiah chapter 13, they were being very unfaithful to their wives and probably either divorcing them, or as I said, it was no matter what, their wives were trapped in a terrible situation. If they didn't divorce them, they were trapped in this relationship with a husband being completely unfaithful. And that would have been a terrible relationship. If they did divorce them, then they were seen to be an outcast anyway. So no matter what, it was a terrible situation with the men being unfaithful. And I think that's what God's really saying here, is that was awful what they were doing to the wife of their covenant.
What God wants is continuity of righteousness in the nation. And it says in the previous verse about a godly seed.
Yes.
What God is looking for. And the divorce, as it is here, and as you say, is destroying the purpose of raising a godly seed.
Absolutely.
God is thinking of the next generation, the next generation.
Yeah.
We may not.
You know, that's a very good point. The whole purpose of it is to raise a godly seed, and that's.
So, Ron, can I ask, in Ezra chapter 10, there's a collective commitment to putting away the foreign wives and children, which, yes, they were not supposed to marry foreigners, but they married foreigners, they made children. And in the light of what God says in Malachi, how do you reconcile that there's this mass divorce program in Ezra chapter 10? I realise it's balancing two commandments because they make this deal that they're going to separate from them. And they gives the big list of all the men. And it said they dealt with them and they made a covenant that they put them away. And I know that was right in one way, but again, the women and kids are the losers.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that with God's hatred? Because the women would have seen it as unfaithful. There's no doubt.
Yeah. As they are not like, you know, this is obviously there were situations where divorce was required, and this is one of them as well. Separation because of the influence of what had happened there, you know. And if Solomon had married strange wives that led him away, you know, in that situation, God would have wanted him to separate from his wives. If it meant, you know, being in covenant with him, and he said, you know, that these women took Solomon's heart away from God. That was the challenge. Solomon was already married to God in that sense. So Solomon's probably the example of what was happening here in Ezra as well. It was the fact that these strange women were bringing their idolatrous worship in. So whilst after, like, you know, if you go through subsequent to the time of Nehemiah's return, Israel never committed idolatry again. You go through the story of the Maccabees, they were very, very faithful to God. But I think it actually comes down to the fact that for about, you know, 70 years after they returned back from captivity, it was a mess. And it was really in jeopardy of being very, very corrupt because of their interrelationship with the people in the land that were now there. So I think that's why it was judged pretty hard by Ezra, and it was judged pretty hard by Nehemiah. because they were kind of being re-established as a nation. So they needed to start, almost like Abraham coming into the land of the Canaanites. They needed to start pure and weed out corruption.
Judah has dealt treacherously and an abomination is committed. And Israel and Jerusalem, for Judah has profaned the holiness of the Lord which he loved and married the daughter of a strange god. So it was all because of that, you know, the strange gods as well. There's that link to that as well.
Yes. So anyway, thank you everybody. The challenge was to try to make it positive because it's a pretty challenging chapter, but it is the Ides of March, and well, the assassination of Julius Caesar. So you know, it was a time that was filled with violence anyway when Brutus got up and assassinated Julius Caesar, and that's where you get the story of the Ides of March. But it was also the day of the Christchurch shootings. So, you know, it is probably a day that's full of somber remembrance of violence and corruption. Oh, that was pretty negative, wasn't it? Sorry. I was going to bring out some positive stuff, but righto. Who can I take on? Who would like to volunteer to close this prayer? How's that sound? Oh, lovely, yeah. That's right.
Our God in heaven, wonderful God, He who dwells alone. We come before you, Heavenly Father, because you created your family, first with the angels, then with your Son, and now with all those that love him and come to you. We acknowledge that this is our privilege from you. And as we look back on the nation of Israel and see how strong their words of commitment were and how their follow through was, we understand that this is the nature of man. We thank you, Heavenly Father, that we have seen tonight that shining through the tragedies of their evil ways is a God of love and mercy who sought to restore and not to destroy. So we pray that amongst the trials and difficulties of this life, we might see the greater purpose you have for each one of us and for the whole world, ultimately. And so now we pray for the coming of Jesus. We pray for your kingdom. We pray at the time when the Gentiles will repair to Jerusalem with an open heart and a willingness to serve the God of Israel, whom they currently reject. We do pray at this time, Heavenly Father, that you would look with favour upon our brothers and sisters, those who we know have trials and others, those who are in times of stress or difficulty, and we each know those amongst us at this time, and so we pray for them. We do also pray, as we often do, for the young amongst us, and the opportunity for a godly seed to be raised and carried through into the next generation, that it may honour you. So we pray these things, thanking you for the gift and the sacrifice of Jesus, which has made all this possible, and without which we are dead men. Christ's sake. Amen.
all right.